Welcome to the State of Developer Education, a podcast by Major League Hacking. We explore how technical leaders are creatively tackling the developer education gap to help prepare the next generation of technologists for the real world and build businesses that can adapt to any changes in the technology ecosystem. I'm your host, John Gottfried. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the State of Developer Education. I'm John from MLH, and I'm here today with Michael Heap, Director of Developer Experience at Kong. How's it going, Michael?
Hey, John. Things are going pretty well. Like yesterday was the shortest day of the year, which means it's only going to get better.
Yep, that is definitely how I feel. I'm tired of the 4 p.m. Sundown.
As am I.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you for joining us. I am definitely excited to hear about a lot of different things you're working on, but I would love to start sort of back at the beginnings of your career. I always find it really helpful to, get some context from my guests about where they came from. Why don't you start off and tell us a little bit about your origin story? How did you get into tech and engineering?
So it's your typical story. I've always been interested in taking things apart to see how they work. I wasn't quite so good at putting them back together again, but I survived. The origin story is a fun one. I used to play an online game, text-based, browser-based, and I must have been about 17. And I was just saying, look, someone's got to give me a job. Like, I need to make some money. And it turns out someone said, oh, actually, one of our suppliers is near you. Let me drop him an email. And long story short, I ended up going and working during the college holidays and things like that for this web agency. And I knew very little at the time. Like, I knew enough to be dangerous programming wise, but nothing about version control or actually being a professional. But they really took me on and helped me learn those things. Did the agency work, decided I didn't like that. Got my degree, then went off to do some product building work. Small pre-seed, failed. After that, Series A, realized this is cool, but a little bit too risky. Went to work for an enterprise, learned a ton of stuff there about navigating organizations, thought this is a bit too big. And now I'm at Kong, which is Series D, which is perfect because it's still early enough that you can have an impact, but not so small that you think, oh, am I still going to have a job tomorrow? Like, is this company going to exist? So yeah, I've tried everything and landed where I like.
It's like the 3 bears, right? You had to try each of the temperatures before you found the sweet spot.
Exactly. And yeah, Series D is definitely the Goldilocks for me.
The game that you mentioned playing when you were, a teenager, are you talking about like a MUD or a BBS? Like, what kind of game was it?
So no, it wasn't a MUD. It was a space-based game. It was called Evolution 5. You build up fleets or armies and work with people. It was quite niche. I think at its peak, it only had 300 to 500 players, but there was a real community feel about it, which is what kept me going back.
But we're talking like the days of the community existing on IRC, I would imagine.
It was IRC based.
Yeah, it's funny. I got into programming through a very similar type of browser game where all of the communication was IRC and then ICQ, if you remember that. And it was a Star Wars themed game, but like really low on functionality, high on community.
Feels very familiar.
Yeah, it's a good gateway drug to becoming a programmer. That's really cool. So you've been at a lot of different organizations, right? And you sort of tested the waters in a lot of different places. It sounds like each of those different orgs has, kind of guided you towards this sweet spot that you're in now. What were some of the things that you learned, let's start with the seed stage startup, and I'm curious about the big enterprise too that drove you in this direction.
So the seed stage was kind of pivotal in my development because it was small and everyone had to do everything. At that point, I knew a single language, so for my sins, I was a PHP developer. We built out this tool. It was actually using the Twitter streaming API. Realized PHP wasn't a good fit. Thought, okay, well, let's learn Node. I can do that. So then I learned Node to do that, and I said, oh well, we need to deploy it somewhere. Oh, how do I deploy a server? And I'm glad that we failed because we definitely shouldn't have shipped my server config into production at that point in time. But it was a great learning experience because the alternative was that it didn't get done. So you just had to kind of power through. Very different to the enterprise experience, where there was a lot of domain and technical knowledge, but it was also much bigger. So you couldn't just rely on those technical skills. You had to learn how to communicate, how to build consensus, how to get buy-in for your projects. Again, a lot of learning, just a different kind. It was more the interpersonal skills than the technical skills at that point.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's interesting because if the seed stage startup had been successful, it may have ended up in a similar spot, right? Like all organizations get to a point where you have to be able to build consensus and buy in on your ideas. I would imagine that Kong is probably not quite as bureaucratic as a big enterprise, but it's a large enough organization that you have to exercise some of those interpersonal skills, right?
You definitely do. The further up the org you go, the more you've got to use those skills because it's not just you anymore; it's the team that you represent.
Mm-hmm.
Like there are limited resources, time, money, servers. Like you've got to be able to negotiate for what you need to make your team successful, which at the end of the day will make the company successful.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I talk a lot with some of the managers that I work with. The difference between a manager and a director, where the manager is quite vertical focused, like down to their team, whereas a director is more horizontal, like working with their peers to try and make everyone successful, but they don't necessarily have much insight into day-to-day of what the team is doing.
I'm curious, like, given that you started as a technical individual contributor, and now it sounds like you're probably in more of a strategy role. How have you made that transition, right? That's a particularly hard transition for a lot of engineers.
So I was very fortunate to work with a coach at one point, and I was leading a small team at the series B startup, and I couldn't understand why the projects that I was kind of bootstrapping weren't getting off the ground. It's like, but look, we're solving customer problems. Customers are happy. Like, why aren't you investing in this? And she turned around and said to me, well, why does the business care? Like, yes, that is technically the right thing to do, but what's in it for them? And that was kind of a light bulb moment for me. And as I started to dig into that, well, why do they care? Like, this is going to cost them more. It's going to be slower. Yes, it's more technically accurate. And I just carried on down that path. Like, okay, well, why are we building this? Who are we building it for? What is the customer trying to achieve? And that's what took me out of that technical day to day into more of the product side, the product development, more of the strategy. I won't say it was easy. You asked how I did it as a technical individual. I read a lot of books. Lots of management books, lots of psychology, like really understanding people. I think if I had to summarize it all in a sentence, it would be make sure you understand what incentives the other person is working under. And that will help you navigate almost any other situation.
Yeah, I think that's really wise advice. I started out as an engineer and also became DevRel, and have had the chance to do sales and marketing and strategy and all of these different, kind of non-technical disciplines. Um, and a lot of it does come back to that, right? Like, how good are you at fitting into other people's goals and worldview, and you know, kind of aligning the things that you are working on to the needs of others in a lot of cases. That's really I like that as a core takeaway. Um, you said that you read a lot of books. Were there any particular books that you would recommend? I I know there's an infinite number of management books out there, but maybe one or two that hit particularly hard.
So the first, which is actually on my list to reread over the holidays, is The Manager's Path by Camille Fournier. That's one that gets recommended a lot for a good reason. And I can't remember the title of the other one. Give me a second.
Sure.
That's the one. It's called Leadership and Self-Deception by the Obinger Institute. It's a short book, but it challenges you to look at yourself anytime something is going wrong. As a leader, it's very easy to say, well, that person didn't do their job, or, well, it's out of my control. But it positions it in a way that makes you think, actually, did I handle this the right way? Could I have seen it coming? The example it gives that really resonated with me is when you're a new parent and the baby's crying and you're laying there and you're thinking, oh, my partner should go and deal with that. Like, I've been at work all day, they haven't. And then they're not moving. And then you think, oh, why are they so lazy? And they haven't done anything. Like, this is you trying to make yourself feel better that you're not getting up and moving.
Yep.
To help with the baby. That's one of the examples, and it really helps frame that. Okay, why am I angry at this person? Like, why am I disappointed? Why do I feel this way? Is it because of something that I'm feeling with myself and I'm deflecting? I highly recommend that to anyone that goes into leading people, because that introspection is super important.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll have to check that out. Um, so, one of the things I noticed when I was looking into your background is that at Nexmo, Vonage, where you were at before Kong, you started as a individual kind of developer advocate type, and eventually became a director level in that department. Um, I'm curious, like, having been on both sides of that table, what are some of the things that individual developer advocates um, may not understand about the overall DevRel strategy that companies have to deploy?
We are very expensive. It's not just the flights and the expenses when we're going to events. There's a lot of tooling that we use that we need to pay for. There's the salaries, like looking for people that have the background that we have, that have enough technical knowledge, that can communicate. Like, it's actually quite a small group of people. And as a lot more businesses start to launch DevRel programs, they're in demand. So DevRel as an org is a non-trivial cost. So as I went from IT to director, and one of the things I focused on was, okay, how can I show the impact that we're having? It's one of the reasons why at Kong, one of the functions I look after is product analytics. And a key part of that is attribution. Like, what content are we producing that is driving sales demos? Like, I know sales is a word that DevRel people don't mention, but it's a really good way to show value. Like, hey, DevRel touched all of these things before the customer signed up. And also on the flip side, so I've at Nexmo, Vonage, and again at Kong, I've done a lot of work with documentation teams, being able to say, hey, go and look at your customer, look at their product usage, but also look what pages on the docs they're visiting. Like that can give you some insight into what they're struggling with. You could reach out and offer paid support. So it's not just like how do we get people in, it's how do we make them successful. And if we can drive revenue through that as well why not?
Yeah, it's certainly something that a lot of DevRel teams struggle with, right? Is justifying their existence. Um, Out of curiosity, does developer experience at Kong fall under marketing or product or engineering or something else entirely?
So we fall under product. That was a very very specific choice for me.
Mm.
I like being involved in the product development. I don't think that you can solve the rough edges in a product from marketing or from engineering. You really do need to be product aligned. And if you can't solve the fundamental things in the product, like how can you advocate for it if you're not proud of it?
Mm.
So yeah, product is key for me. But I'm very fortunate. We actually have a developer marketing team as well that sits within marketing. It's run by a lady that I was heavily involved with the Kubernetes community.
Mhm.
So really understands developers as well. And it's a bit like products and engineering, like product, set the vision, engineering, deliver it.
Mm.
It's the same with developer marketing and developer relations at Kong. The marketing side will drive a lot of the campaigns, on a lot of the metrics, and DevRel are the boots on the ground, interacting with the community, making it a success.
Interesting. So marketing might plan the actual engagements, but DevRel are often the ones who staff them.
That's true.
Interesting. It's funny because, as you probably know, like DevRel, Dev marketing, Dev advocacy often get used interchangeably. But it sounds like you have a very specific idea, at least at Kong, of what each one represents.
We do, and people still get confused. Like we explain this probably once a quarter
Mhm.
to a large audience, but it really works for us. It allows us to bring uh, the experience from both groups. Like I don't know the first thing about um, building newsletter mailing lists
Mhm.
and distribution and all the segmentation, but I don't have to because I can fall back on my marketing colleague who knows that inside out. At the same time, she couldn't run early access programs for betas and things, like writing the quick start guides and producing the videos,
Mhm.
but we can. So it's a very symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, to go in a slightly different direction, we talked about making that transition from IC to management. Um, One of the things I noticed when I was looking at your blog and website is that you still do a lot of technical projects, right? It's clearly part of your life. I don't know how much it relates to your job, but I'd be curious to hear, like, how do you balance, working on interesting technical projects with management responsibilities, with, you know, different things that you have on your plate.
I don't do it at work is
Mm.
the answer. I made this mistake when I first transitioned from IC to manager. I still wanted to do the tech thing like a lot of us do. And then I remember there was one project in particular where it just stalled because I was on holiday or I was in meetings or something like that. And the team said, well, Michael was building this and no one else knows how it works. It's like, yeah, I probably shouldn't be doing that anymore. So now I try very specifically not to be on the critical path for projects. I will still like run a spike on something, say, oh, this looks interesting. Let me see if it's feasible. And if it is, hand it off to someone that will do a much better job of it. But I'm still an engineer. Like I still need to build those projects. So I like to do a lot of open source work. That's all in my free time, unrelated to my day job. It can be anything. I'm currently working on a CLI tool for Trello. I built the first version in 2016 at a hackathon. And I wanted to learn TypeScript. So I thought, okay, let's rebuild it using Oak-Leaf and all that goodness. And that's how I still build out that's how I still get my technical kick without doing it in the day-to-day job, mainly open source.
Where do your ideas come from, right? Like most technical projects are solving some kind of problem. It could be a personal problem, business problem, a friend's problem. Like, where do you source your ideas?
They are all personal problems for me. I'm very lazy. If I have to do something more than once, I will spend sometimes way too much time automating it. I've done everything, like the Trello CLI. Like I just wanted to say, like, what's due today? Didn't want to have to open a browser, just give it me in my terminal. But I've also done things like written a CLI tool that logs into, automates a browser, logs into our payslips portal and downloads the PDF of my payslip and then moves it. It was Dropbox at the time. Now it's iCloud. But then I set that running on the cron. And every month, my payslip is backed up on my own device and I don't have to do anything with it. So yeah, lots of, I'm lazy, I don't want to do this. Let's just try and automate it somehow.
I like that. So it seems like you're kind of prolific, right, in terms of the open source projects you've been building. Have any of them garnered their own community of contributors, or perhaps even a large number of users?
None have built a community.
Mm.
A lot of that is me. I am not a great community builder
Mm.
because I do it to scratch my own itch. But some of the projects have quite a few users. Let's use Trello CLI, like that's packaged for some Linux distributions as an example. So you can just run apt install Trello CLI and it will work. A lot of the projects that have picked up steam are actually GitHub Actions. So I got into GitHub Actions very early on, built a few. There's companies like Brave Browser, GitLab, Vimeo, all using actions that I've built. Now, there's not much of a community around these because they're actually quite small and self-contained. A lot of them are finished. Like they don't need active maintenance apart from security updates. But they are very heavily used, even by people like Rust, the programming language. So yeah, it tends to be less community, but high usage.
Yeah. Did you say that GitLab is using your GitHub Actions?
Yes.
Can you talk me through that? That's a little counterintuitive.
So I can't remember which one it was using. Actually, I can probably pull it up here. Let's see. Yes. So GitLab have a GitHub repo for the Terraform provider. It's now been migrated to GitLab. Last month, it was migrated, so I need to check that. But until recently, yeah, it was using one of my GitHub Actions. Yeah, November the 9th, it migrated.
Oh wow, that's really recent.
Yeah.
That's cool. So a lot of your early work on GitHub Actions, it seems like has led to some interesting, reusable use cases, but you also wrote a book about it. Like obviously GitHub Actions was not the first tool to do exactly what it does, but why did it attract your attention in such a deep way when it did come out?
I like things that work together. So before GitHub Actions, I was a big Jenkins user.
Yep.
That was one of the conference talks that I traveled around giving, the Jenkins file and the scripted pipelines. But Jenkins is still its own thing that you've got to install and deploy and manage. I really like when a tool just gives me everything that I need, when my code is next to my CI, which is next to my projects. Like the less wiring together I have to do personally, the better. It goes back to me being lazy. Like, yes, I could set up GitHub Actions with Travis or with Jenkins, and then hook that up to Jira. But all the time that I'm spending linking those together and maintaining those connections is time that I'm not spending building things, which is what I actually set out to do. So that's why GitHub Actions caught my attention. Is some like CI/CD is something that I believe every project needs, and having it co-located with my code just made sense to me.
Yeah. So you wrote a book about it. I'm really fascinated by the idea of technical books in the modern age. Like when I was getting started coding, that was one of the only reliable resources to learn a new tech or language. Now, I mean, we have the internet. So why write a book? Like, what was the benefit of, putting something out there in like a static kind of monolithic way?
So I was already learning this stuff and talking about it with colleagues. And I was getting a lot of questions like, well, how do you do this? How do you do that? And I figured I had to write it down for them anyway. So why not package it all up and use it as a learning opportunity? So actually learning GitHub Actions and writing the book, that wasn't the high part or the interesting part. But how do you build an ebook? Like, how do you distribute that? Like, how do you build a good landing page? Like, what does marketing this look like? That's what I did it for, not to write the book, not to sell the book, but to provide myself with the opportunity to learn more about the sales, marketing, and distribution side of things, so that I could then build more empathy with those roles in my day-to-day work. I've got a lot of empathy for them. Sympathy is probably a better word. Definitely not for me, the sales and marketing side. The book's doing okay, but it could do a lot better if I really went all in on the marketing and promotions.
Interesting. That's really cool. I love the idea of using it as a mechanism to learn a new skill. Like writing the book in itself was not the goal. The goal was to learn this skill. The book was just a means to an end. It feels like there's a lot of things that you're talking about that fit that same pattern, right? Like, solving your own problems, figuring out how to manage people. Like all of these are interesting, almost like methodologies for advancing your own skill set. Yeah. Do you have like a guiding philosophy that you follow, or does it just happen to all fit your sort of normal behavioral pattern?
It's pretty normal for me. Someone once summarized it as, I'm an engine builder. I don't like to do things myself for a long period of time. Let's build a system that enables it. And then once that system is running, like, okay, how can we make it more efficient? How can we make it bigger? And to do that, you've got to understand all the component parts.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of it. The other part is be the Kool-Aid man. The big shape that just runs through the walls. Like that's the other half of it. Like, if you don't know how to do it, just figure it out. Like, ask someone, try it, fail. I've failed more times than I care to admit. But as long as you learn from that, and you say, okay, well, what can I do differently this time? There's a lot to be said for running through walls until you're successful.
Yeah. What are some notable failures?
Um, my very first job when I was at the agency, they asked me to do some cleanup of a server. I accidentally inverted some logic, and instead of deleting all the backup files, I deleted all the live files and took all the sites offline.
Yep.
Um, and then it deleted the backup files as well. So that was interesting. Um,
What did you do
I
about it?
we had offsite backups,
Okay.
thankfully. I did sit for it was about 4 hours where I didn't tell anyone. I was like, no, I can fix this. I can find them. And I eventually told my boss, who was the owner of the agency, and he was like, okay, I'll restore the backups. They're only from yesterday. Next time, tell me faster.
Yeah.
Learning opportunity. I've managed to rack up large bills with infinite loops in processing pipelines. That one is never fun. There's
Hmm.
a lot of asking forgiveness then. I also fails a lot with people, like assuming that you should treat everyone the same.
Hmm.
Like that's fairly common management advice. It took me a long time to realize that actually should treat people the way they need to be treated,
Mm.
like what works for them. The difference between equal and equitable.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I've made mistakes with tech, people, finance, like you name it, I've made it.
So I love the differentiation between equal and equitable. I do think that's probably under appreciated aspect of working on larger teams. Um, one of the things I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about, since we've talked so much about like the human side of things, um, what do you look for when you're building teams? Like what are the traits and skills that make up a good developer experience organization?
Differences. I do know what an org where everyone is the same. Um, there's a few schools of thought on this. Some people say, go and find the absolute best person you can for this role. If you get 3 great people, let's hire 3 great people. But what happens is you hire 3 great people, they've all got different ideas, they all want to do the wrong thing and they clash.
Hmm.
Um, instead, I look for the gaps in the team. Like, okay, we've got some people that are fantastic at starting projects, coming up with innovative ideas, but they're not great at making sure that once we've produced it, that it's syndicated correctly, that we're tracking the metrics to see what resonates. Okay, well, let's hire someone that's a bit more back office, that doesn't want to be out on stage, but is a bit more detail oriented.
Hmm.
Um, so I hire them, and then we say, oh well, actually, we're doing a lot of content that is quite high level, which is great. We get the people brand new to the ecosystem, but some of our customers are asking for technical deep dives, and we don't have that on the team. Okay, let's hire someone with a technical background, specifically in the technology that we're working with, to do some of that content. So it really is look for what you're missing and plug the gaps.
Do you have any duplication? Like when is it warranted to have multiple people with similar skill sets?
When they're in different time zones.
Hmm.
So I'm a big believer in distributed teams as well. Kong is a global company, like West Coast to Japan. And for the Asia Pacific region, having to wait until the US West Coast wakes up, like that's just not feasible. So building self-contained pods in regions is something that I like. The other time to hire similar people is when they need to balance each other.
Mm.
If you've got someone that is super business focused, like how do we impact the bottom line, and has a lot of ideas, they might also hire someone that is also very passionate, but on the community side.
Mhm.
And yes, they're both great at what they do. They're both very vocal, but they balance each other out when it comes to what the team should be doing.
Mhm.
Um, so I guess they're similar in some aspects, but still different in others.
Yeah. So when you actually joined Kong, like what did that department look like versus what have you built it into? Like what is that evolution been?
So when I started, it was just me. I believe you've spoken to Victor Gamov. He
Yeah.
was also on his way to Kong. We both interviewed at the same time.
Mhm.
Name's just Vic and I. Developer experience is now 10 people, covering developer relations, documentation, and product analytics.
So you've had to build that entire team and strategy, or did the founders or the chief product officer have a vision for what this was going to look like?
So two of the people were internal transfers, but the other eight were direct hires.
Mhm.
Um, I'm very fortunate. My VP trusts in what we do, so it's very team driven. The strategy. I won't say it's me because it's very much a team driven thing. My job is just translating what we do into business speak for the exec team to make sure that we continue to get funded.
Yeah. Necessary part of any developer focused org. Um, so we've spoken a lot about sort of your own path, what you do, what you're excited about. Um, I'd love to hear some advice that you have for, folks who are maybe a bit earlier in their careers, right? It sounds like you've been really motivated by trying different things and new things and solving problems. You know, how do you recommend that other people get their start and advance?
I think the biggest advice is just to get started and try something. Like community is a huge part of it.
Hmm.
Um, I found my first job through a community. Okay, it wasn't a technical community, but it put me in a situation where I could learn from people.
Yeah.
And that's been a driving force. So when you're evaluating roles, like try and find a job where it's a big-ish team, not so big that you just fade into obscurity, uh, but kind of 3, 5, 10 people is a perfect size for you to go in and learn from people.
Hmm.
You can learn what works, what doesn't. And then my rule of thumb for staying at a job, assuming things are going well, is 3 to 4 years.
Hmm.
Um, and then jump ship and try and find another business about the same size, um, perhaps in a different industry or a different tech stack, and then learn from that audience and then start building up, well, what's the same, what's different. So yeah, the advice is get started doing something and constantly be looking for groups that you can join to learn things.
A big part of learning, at least in my own experience, has been failing. And I know that you said you failed quite a bit as well. Do you think that uh, organizations of that size, right, when you're not a seed stage startup, but maybe, you know, Series C or D, have as many opportunities for people to fail? And I know that's an odd question, but I mean, it's, honestly.
It's a very good question. My honest answer is no. There is a lot less margin for error compared to, say, an enterprise. Um, when I was at Vonage, we hired a lot of second career developers, people fresh out of boot camps, knowing that we had the ecosystem to support them.
Mhm.
And if they made a mistake, well, okay, it might cost a little bit of money, a bit of time, but it's not going to sink the business. Series C, Series D probably still won't sink the business if the business is set up correctly. Like if a new hire can kill your business, then something else went wrong. It's not the new hire's fault.
Mhm.
Like that's a business failing. But um, the atmosphere um, will probably change in that kind of environment. Like, okay, we've got to watch them a bit more closely. I'm a big fan of the one-way door or two-way door concept
Mhm.
from Amazon. If it's a two-way door, let them go through it, make whatever mistakes they want, knowing that they can come back through. As leaders, it's our job to identify the one-way doors and make sure we catch things before they go through them. So, yeah, focus on the bigger companies where you can fail safely, but also try and find a team where someone is watching out for you to stop you making those irreversible mistakes.
Yeah, that's great. Um, so failure is kind of the we'll call it like the chaotic good method of learning. Um, how do you kind of build more structured learning activities for people on your team, right? Because not everyone will necessarily want to go play around with tech stacks after work, right? Like a lot of that has to happen, within the workday. So how do you actually structure that into your team's goals and what you need to accomplish?
We're fortunate that we have a lot of domain experts within the business. This is actually a question I asked during the interview process. Like, if you join us and you're doing a lot of the work that you're paid to do, what would you want to learn on the side? We've got a tooling engineer, Ruby on Rails background, lots of Ruby. Our doc site is Jackal, so he's doing a lot of that. But he also wants to learn more about the cloud native space, Kubernetes. Wonderful. Like we have people that are part of the Gateway API Kubernetes special interest group internally. Let me connect the two of you. Like you can have a coffee, have a chat. Like that's how you drive learning in a structured way for me. Like you make introductions, you use your network to enable um, others to have those conversations, understand if it's something they're interested in, and get recommendations from the experts because you can't do everything.
Yeah. Um, Thinking in a broader sense, if you could change anything about how developers are currently being educated, what would that be? And you mentioned boot camps, you mentioned you went to college, like looking at the entire world of how people become developers.
The tongue in cheek answer is less videos. I,
Why do you say that?
I'm just a text person.
Hmm.
I can read faster than I can watch. I don't have the attention span for watching. That is a very tongue in cheek answer. Um,
Personal preference.
what would I change? I would probably not. Let me start again. Um, I would stop people writing so many tutorials, like follow this, follow this, follow this. Instead, I'd like to see us focus more on here is the problem that I want you to solve. Like try and build it, and perhaps here are some of the errors that you might hit, and here are some links to useful materials to help you understand them and fix them. But there are so many people that just follow tutorials, think, okay, I'm successful, it worked. But then you try and change any of that and they can't get off the rails.
Hmm.
I think that's probably the biggest thing I would change instead of um, holding their hands so far down the line. Like, do it a little bit, but then give them an independent problem to solve. Because that's what really makes you learn.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the beauty of hackathons or really any other project-based learning exercise is that you are forced to apply a lot of the knowledge that you've learned abstractly in a very concrete way. Um, so I completely agree. I think that's an absolute necessity for people who want to become developers.
Nice.
So the question I always like to end on is kind of just like a fun hypothetical one. You know, if there's any person in the world, ideally someone in the tech world that you could take to lunch for a couple of hours that you've never met, who might that be? Who do you aspire to spend some time with?
I think this will probably be Julia Evans.
Why?
She has such an approachable way of teaching. I love all the designs that she draws. I just think they're an incredible way of getting actually quite detailed information. Like, how does DNS work?
Mhm.
Like, that's a big question for someone that doesn't even know what DNS is, but they can read a couple of pages of her drawings and at least know what questions to ask.
Hmm.
I think that a lot of technical people know a lot of the answers, but struggle communicating it in an accessible way. And I'd love to pick her brains on, like, hey, instead of just writing 30,000 words of text, like, how do I get this out of my head and into everyone else's to help make them successful as well?
Awesome. I love that. She does incredible work. I would also like to meet her very much. Um, well, thank you so much, Michael. I really enjoyed our conversation and everything you had to share. I appreciate your time. If people listening enjoyed it, please do follow and subscribe. We'll be publishing more episodes on an ongoing basis. But thanks again, and happy hacking.
It's been great to be here, John. Enjoy the rest of your day.
The State of Developer Education is brought to you by Major League Hacking, or MLH. To find out more about MLH and how we power innovation, cultivate developer communities, and teach technical skills to students around the world, visit mlh.io. And then make sure to search for Developer Education in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at MLH, thanks for listening and helping us empower the next generation of technologists. Happy hacking!